Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Hodges. It made me realize that when I put my presentation together in a typical veterinary, data-focused fashion, I jumped right into the content, right? And so I think your introduction was really useful for bringing us back to that bigger picture of why on earth do veterinarians and agriculture animal health need to sit down and talk with human health. So in my typical fashion, there's a few of you in the room who know me and I tend to go about 1 million miles a minute, I skipped all that. And so I think I actually mentioned the word resistance once in my entire presentation. But of course, the whole reason we're here talking is because there's the concern of resistant bacteria on meat, which is then potentially going to be a zoonotic disease for our people. So my apologies for skipping sort of that really obvious connection. But what I'm going to jump into is trying to give you a super high-level view of why and how we use antimicrobials in agriculture. And I really am skipping that whole connection between the antimicrobial use and what we're seeing on resistance. I'm really talking about the use piece. And when Wendy sent me the email to present at this conference, that was my exact response. Like, seriously? Why me? I have no idea why you would want me to come to this presentation because in my past life, I have been a veterinarian and I have been an epidemiologist. But what you have standing in front of you today is a consumer, is a mom, and is a cow-calf producer. So I'm probably going to bring you a presentation that's like super non-tech, low-level basic, but I'm really pleased looking around the room today. I do see at just about every table colleagues of mine that are subject matter experts in every single industry. I've seen people from the pork industry here. We've got some chicken people here, and certainly lots of the cow-calf in the feedlot sector. So when you send me the hard questions, folks that know me, I'm turning to you. And when we think about farming, I think a lot of us think of this. This is my husband and my son looking at our cows. We'd like to think of this very pretty pastoral view of what a farm is and how we treat animals. And those cows have a very low stocking density, and their rates of illness and needing to be treated are incredibly low. But the fact is, where our food comes from and where we have our health pressures in agriculture aren't so much in what we typically think. They're in our intensive modern agricultural systems. Our modern agricultural systems are not going away. They are systems where we bring in large populations, large numbers of animals that have very similar risk factors. There'll be similar health status, similar age, and when we get an infectious disease in there, we have the potential for a substantial health impact on those animals. And so we certainly have a strong need to retain access to antimicrobials in agriculture. But increasingly, we're thinking not even so much about those cattle in the feedlot or those broiler chickens in the barn. What we're thinking about is the meat that we're producing. And the food safety aspect of what we're trying to achieve as an industry is becoming more and more front of mind of what we're doing. And of course, healthy animals make healthy meat. I'm going to touch a little bit at the end of my presentation on this. So we've gone from this pretty pastoral view to meat and food safety, but increasingly as an industry, those of us who are looking at it from a business perspective, we're actually not even producing food anymore, we're producing ingredients. And the marketplace is incredibly sophisticated. What people are demanding and expecting as far as niche markets, raised without antibiotics, never ever programs, all that stuff is becoming an increasing pressure on agriculture as well. So this isn't, from our perspective as producers, strictly a scientific conversation anymore. This is also a business and a marketing and a positioning conversation that we're having to have. So I love Stephen Covey, love Stephen Covey. I dream of being an effective person, and so, but I actually think that antimicrobial stewardship is that classic win-win that Covey preaches. Healthy animals are a win for obviously the livestock themselves. That's a welfare issue. it is a win for the producer. If I as a producer have healthy animals, I'm clearly making more money and my animals are more productive. It is a win for the consumer because they are getting food at a lower cost and they're getting safe, healthy meat. And of course that goes right on down through Canadians and the environment and everything that Dr. Hodge talked about. So it's a no-brainer that agriculture wants to use antimicrobials appropriately. So why are we even here having this conversation? Well, I think it's because as an industry, what we have to do when we're looking at our antimicrobial toolbox is we go back and we say, where's the risk? And the risk is in those livestock way back at the beginning of the chain in the intensive production. And as a producer, we say, what do I have the ability to influence? Again, it's the health of those animals, which I can and often do through the use of antimicrobials. And as a veterinarian, I'm looking and saying, what's in my toolbox? What medical interventions do I have to influence the health of those animals? And so often, our toolbox as veterinarians is very limited relative to what those of you who are human physicians in the room would be used to having at your disposal. And by that toolbox, I mean not only the medical interventions that we have to apply to those animals, but also the diagnostics and the other management factors for environment or managing risk factors. Our toolbox is incredibly different, I think, than what you guys have to choose from your repertoire. So we go back to the farm and we go back to the livestock operations, and what I'd like to do is try and give you a sense of some of the background on the decision making of how and why and when we reach for antimicrobials. What I'm not going to get into today, I'm not going to get into the what, as in like certain diseases and treatments and all that. I don't think that that's particularly relevant to this audience, nor am I going to, like I said, get into the resistance. So we have a continuum in any population between optimal health, which is where we want the bulk of our population, and dead animals, right? That seems pretty obvious. I'm sure most of you have that. What the challenge is we also have in this spectrum, is we have animals who will be overtly ill, and then that is typically the tip of the iceberg as far as what animals in that population might be subclinically affected. And those subclinically affected animals are important from a production point of view because they are not going to be producing at the rate that they should be, but clearly they're also a massive health threat to that population because that becomes the tipping point in our population. So this is a picture of some grow-finished pigs, and the pig in purple has been marked because the stock person has identified that pig as having ileitis, which is an inflammation of the intestine caused by a bacterial cause. So in this case, we're talking about generally a group of animals that are largely in optimal health and an individual who has overt illness. In this instance, it would be probably appropriate for the stock person to go and individually treat that pig. Here we have a similar group of grow-finished pigs. I don't know if you can spot the difference. In the first picture, the vast majority of pigs are, well-rounded, well-fleshed, looking good. Here you can see most of the pigs are sort of ganted up and thin. So here we have a population where there might be the odd one who is overtly ill, but the vast majority are actually on that tip of subclinical to early clinical illness. And this, for those of us who work in population medicine, this is what we're dealing with day in and day out. We're dealing with odds and probability and return on investment, and when do we treat and when don't we? Because what we don't want to get to is this, and I'll take that off quickly for those of you who just ate your bacon. So one of the messages that I want to communicate to those of you in the room who are not part of veterinary medicine is that we sit on a tipping scale all the time where occasionally we're dealing with individual animal medicine and trying to find the optimal treatment for that animal, but more often than not we are trying to find the optimal intervention for a population of animals to mitigate the risk of disease going through that group of animals. So it's a very different mindset than what my impression of what most medical people would deal with the exception of maybe those who are working in population health. Okay, bear with me for a second. For those of you who are doodlers and the doodling keeps you awake, please go ahead and doodle this. For those of you who are like type A, linear thinkers, whatever, just use your imagination. No one's looking at your paper when we're done anyways. Doodle out what I described to you. There's a man, he's slightly overweight, not obese, but slightly overweight. He's confused. He's not quite sure what to do. He's got good food choices, he's got bad food choices. He knows that this is affecting his future and he's considering it. Does everybody have a bit of an image of this picture that I have in my mind? That's him. Okay, so this is the risk of trying to give a room full of people a description of how antimicrobials are used in agriculture. I'm pretty sure not one of you imagined this picture. And the danger of me having to be the person up here on the stage today is I'm worried that I'm going to give you just enough information to have one image, but the reality is completely different. So I'm trying to not equip you to the point of just being dangerous. I'm trying to open a conversation on how and what we do. So bear with me and this crazy gentleman that we're dealing with. Okay, so in agriculture, like I said, we have those pigs where we're talking about, or cattle or whatever the case may be, where we're talking about the individual and we're trying to address the ones that have overt illness and manage the ones that have subclinical. But frankly, when we're using our antimicrobials, this is much more of a continuum. This is not a black and white thing. Growth promotion is on there simply because it's a word that's still in our vernacular when we talk about antimicrobial use in agriculture. I'm pleased to say that finally now in Canadian regulations, we no longer have any antimicrobials registered for use as growth promotants. That's happened in the last year or so. But the reality is we have not used antimicrobials for growth promotion or for really treating those optimal health animals in decades. That is language that comes from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s when we really didn't even understand what and how antimicrobials worked or what we were doing. We just knew they made the chickens grow faster, right? So that whole growth promotion, I think we can take off. And I really would be very pleased at this conference if the 2 minutes I just took up talking about growth promotion are the only conversation we have to have about that. What we do use antimicrobials for is prevention, control, and treatment. So prevention is the definitions can be a bit fuzzy, but typically we think of prevention as using an antimicrobial in a population of animals ahead of a disease being necessarily diagnosable, which I'm sure some of you, your spine just, like, what are you people doing? But what we know is we have very, very predictable systems in agriculture, and so we know that if we're putting in 7-week-old nursery pigs into this same barn, into the same environment, we can predictably say on day number 4 they're going to start to break with an E. coli scours. We're not going to wait until 10 or 15% of the population is sick before we treat. We're going to preventatively go in ahead of that and get ahead of that very predictable disease. That's what preventative medicine is. Control, on the flip side, would be when we go in and we say, yeah, 10% of the pigs are sick. We need to be more aggressive with our medical intervention, and we need to address, keeping all of these pigs from getting sick or, a certain percentage dying. So it's a little bit of semantics between prevention and control, but they're becoming increasingly important when I get down to talking about what industry is doing. I think that distinction has become increasingly important. Treatment, of course, has and always will continue to happen. Individual animal treatment, with the exception of aquaculture and poultry, definitely happens. And individual treatment is very, very important as an animal welfare tool, because those animals were overtly sick and we need to pull them, get them in a situation where they do not have to compete for food and water in the same way, maybe have a little bit more space and can receive some direct medical intervention. So when we talk about prevention, control, and treatment, I'm an epi, I'm a production medicine type of person. I am thinking population medicine. When we do that, in general, the only feasible way to get the medication in these animals is either through feed, water, or mass injection. And mass injection is often not a very palatable way. You can imagine that if you've got 2,500 feeder pigs in a barn, you can imagine that we're going to want to get the medication in those animals in another route that, number one, is lower labor, but also number two is lower stress on those animals. So that's why we use feed and water medication. You guys will have heard the phrases just like we have, oh, those bleep, bleep, bleep farmers, they just sprinkle the antimicrobials on their feed like I don't put that on my kids' cornflakes. That's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because it's a way to get it into those animals quickly, effectively. The challenge being that sick animals don't eat and drink as well, and so again, that's why we need to be somewhat preemptive in how we go and do that. Never say never, seldom say always. My dad used to say that all the time. This cow is my daughter's cow. It is nursing a calf. This is a case where even as a production animal person, I'm still thinking very much individual animal medicine in this case, and I'm probably going to go above and beyond, you know, what's maybe economically feasible. Don't tell her I said that. But you know, so when I'm talking, I really am talking general strokes about modern intensive livestock production, but you need to remember that, you know, particularly in cow-calf, we are still talking very much individual animal medicine, which actually brings up a conversation I was having with Margot at the back. You know, some of the challenges with this is that it can be very, very difficult to treat these animals individually when they're out on range, and so we, you know, there's not necessarily corrals, there's not necessarily easy ways to round them up. So we deal with different administration issues when we're talking cow-calf, but again, let's just focus on the population for now. So when we first started having a conversation about antimicrobials in agriculture, probably back in the 80s, I'm gonna guess, residues were the key focus, right? We were focusing on making sure that the meat that goes to the consumer has no detectable levels of antimicrobials left in it. And all of our regulations were built around minimizing residues. So if you talk to a producer, they know exactly what you mean when you talk about withdrawal time, because the withdrawal time is the amount of time that you need to elapse between the last time that animal was exposed to an antimicrobial and the time it is slaughtered for consumption by humans. And that's a chemical issue, it's a very predictable issue, and it's what we in agriculture have been taught to think about as risk management when we talk about antimicrobials. But now, here's my one time that I mentioned resistance. Now, of course, we know that it's so much more than that. Now we have this biological issue called resistance, and it isn't predictable like the residues were. It's not like we can just say, oh, that cow didn't have tetracycline for 48 days, therefore there's going to be no resistant bacteria in the gut bacteria that could potentially contaminate the meat. We know that there are resistant enteric bacteria in those animals, and so we're managing a completely different problem with, sometimes when we talk to producers, an old-fashioned paradigm. That's one of our challenges in communication, I think. This table will be of no surprise to anyone in the room, I wouldn't think, but this is the WHO classification of antibiotics for their importance in human health. And this table has really become the cornerstone of our programming and our policy in agriculture for how we stratify our risk management of our use of antimicrobials. The thing I do want to point out to those of you who aren't in livestock is that category 4, which the World Health Organization categorizes as low risk, is our ionophores and our flavomycins. These are antimicrobials that have no known use at this point in human medicine. We use them extensively in agriculture, and at this point we are not doing anything to attempt to minimize or decrease or control the use of those category 4 antimicrobials. And so that's maybe something that you guys don't have a common conversation about. What we do talk about is certainly the category 1, 2, 3. As the category 1s, the ones that are licensed for use in veterinary medicine, being your third generation cephalosporins and your enrofloxacins. And again, this is actually a great time to point out, I really am talking about agriculture and livestock production. I'm sure we have people in the audience who do companion animal medicine. I don't know anything other than a cat has 4 legs, so I am not talking about that. So what do we know about what we use in agriculture? CAHI, which is the Canadian Animal Health Institute, reports sales data every year. This is the 2016 data. Don't worry about the details, but the thing I want to point out to you is that when we look at sales data, which is by the denominator is kilograms sold, You know, half of our use is our tetracyclines, which is a category 3 drug. Half of our use is a mishmash of category 2 drugs. And you can see there's a tiny sliver at the very, very top. That's your category 1 cephalosporin. So what are we using in agriculture? And they do not include the category 4s in here, which would massively dwarf this graph. We're using category 2s and 3s is what we're using. Based on that sales data, what we know is that 76% of the antimicrobials administered are through feed and 12% are administered through water. So that's how we're getting those category 2s and 3s into those animals. There is, I'm going to say 150 pages worth of detailed analysis on antimicrobial use in the broiler industry, the turkey industry, and in grow-finished swine that's published by CPARS, the Canadian Integrated Program for Antimicrobial Resistance Surveillance group. And the 2016 data has just come out. So I'm not going to go into all of those details. I think that's there. It's available on the web for people who really want that level of detail. That is the place to go. They are the people who are doing our on-farm surveillance, and they are working to expand the commodities that they currently are not looking at. This also comes from that CPARS data, and I actually want to point this out for 2 reasons. So this is the sales of antimicrobials. Again, this is that CAHI data, adjusted by population and weight for Canada in 2016. And what they're doing is they're ranking the countries. This graph makes my skin crawl. I can't even begin to tell you how upsetting this graph is. So somebody from the audience, does it make you proud to see Canada as number 4? No, of course it doesn't, right? Of course that's an upsetting graph for us to look at. And that you can see on number, I think 7 or 8, they've adjusted us because in Europe, these are standardized calculations and the standard weights of animals are slightly different and blah, blah, blah. So we can have a debate whether we should be number 4 or number 8. What bothers me about this graph is for those of you in industry, if you take a close look at this, do you see any of our market competitors on this graph? No, you do not. So of course, we are using, when we talk about by kilogram, substantially more kilograms of antimicrobials than a country like Iceland, because we actually are feeding the world in Canada. We are major exporters of beef. We are major exporters of pork. And we cover all of our domestic consumption of poultry and dairy in this country, while only being number 4 or 7. So that's why I wanted to put up this graph. We don't want to be defensive, and we don't want to say there's nothing to change. There's lots of change needed in agriculture. There's lots of room for improvement. But in the same time, we are using our antimicrobials to feed not only Canadians, but to feed the world. So we started off as an industry talking about residues. We moved on to resistance. And increasingly, our focus has been on regulation. In the last 24 months, the Canadian government has implemented some substantial regulatory changes that have been talked about for well over a decade. And so producers and veterinarians are currently in the process of adjusting to these new regulations. One of them is there will no longer be category 1, 2, or 3 antimicrobials available for sale in Canada without a veterinary prescription, which requires a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. This has been a long time coming in Canada. This will substantially affect producers in that for cow-calf producers like myself, I used to be able to go into PV Mart and grab a bottle of tetracycline. That's part of it. The bigger part is historically, as long as you were using feed scripts, according to the Canadian Medical CMIB, whatever that government document is, as long as you were using your feed scripts according to those levels, you didn't actually need a veterinary prescription. And I just told you that 76% of our antimicrobials are administered through feed, right? And so that whole system is changing, which is a substantial business interruption for us. But ultimately what that will do is it will ensure that we've got veterinary oversight of all antimicrobial use in Canada. So I think ultimately, while there will be some growing pains for us in industry, this will be a good thing. The other thing that I mentioned when I showed that growth promotions being crossed off is at the same time, industry voluntarily pulled all of those growth promotion claims from feed meds that were still on the market from years ago. And so we no longer have those claims, which I think it just simplifies communication. We've had some minor changes to what I call own use importation and active pharmaceutical ingredients, but I don't think those pertain to the resistance discussion quite the same, and so I'm just going to gloss over those. So increasingly as industry, we're adjusting to this new regulatory environment, but our consumers, you folks, everyone is really demanding more of us of how we're using antimicrobials. And so stewardship has become an increasingly important part of what we're focused on. Every industry has a very specific pressure point. We use antimicrobials for a wide range of things, but there's always a pressure point. So in chicken production, it's those broiler birds that are only on the farm for, 32, 34 odd days. In pork production, it's our nursery pigs, those recently weaned pigs. They are our pressure point for managing their health. And in the beef industry, it is those young weaned calves where we see particularly respiratory disease. So these are industry-specific issues. Again, I'm not going to get into the how and the what of what we're treating, but what I need you to understand is these are highly specialized and technical industries, and so it's sort of beyond us to get into those details, but what you need to understand is that every industry definitely has a real pressure point where we have groups of animals that are at high risk for bacterial infections, where we absolutely need those antimicrobials to protect their health and welfare. So some examples of industry-led stewardship programs that we're seeing, for example, the Canadian Pork Council, they have had a quality assurance program since 1998, I believe. But recently they have come out with some industry regulations. So this is, how they enforce that is sort of beyond this discussion. But they are prohibiting the use of Category 1 drugs for disease prevention. So again, you're going to need a diagnosis to demonstrate the diseases in the barn to justify the use of those Category 1s. And they have, of course, prohibited the use of Category 1, 2, and 3 for growth promotion, but now with the change of regulation, that's less relevant. But note, they did that well before the government adjusted those regulations. And they are moving towards restrictions on the use of Category 2 drugs for disease prevention. The chicken industry has been absolute leaders in the industry-led management of antimicrobial use, for good and for bad. I work with them, so I think I'm allowed to say that in public. They eliminated the preventative use of Category 1 antimicrobials in May of 2014. And they did that based on CPAR's data that showed that there was a rise in ceftiofur resistance in Salmonella Heidelberg coming out of eggs, let me back up. The CPARs demonstrated that the use of ceftiofur in the hatchery was leading to increasing rates of resistance to third-generation cephalosporins in the Salmonella Heidelberg that was affecting Canadians. The chicken industry in Canada responded immediately, and they banned the use of ceftiofur in their hatcheries as soon as they recognized there was a perceived public health risk. They've since gone forward and they've eliminated the preventative use of Category 2s by the end of last year, so they're really just starting in on that phase, and their goal is to eliminate the preventative use of antimicrobials by 2020. So the reason I say it's a bit of a mixed blessing is this, of all of the industries we have in Canada, poultry is certainly the easiest one to eliminate the use of antimicrobials in. Those birds are only on the farm for 30 some odd days, and I think it's putting a lot of pressure on the pork and the beef industry to sort of keep pace, but we're working in very, very different production environments. But it is interesting to see an industry step up and make such substantial impact on their use without government regulation. So what affects our antimicrobial use and stewardship on farms or in industry? Well, I'm not going to go through this exhaustive list. What I want you to know is that we have factors at the population level, so the individual farm or the individual production company, things like how many animals do we have in an airspace that are at risk of a disease, or what's our stocking density, how well vaccinated are these animals, and of course within that production system there's certain animals that are at much higher risk of being treated, like the neonates or the recently weaned animals, than the mature breeding stock. We also have to take in industry factors when we decide whether we're using antimicrobials. So is the herd closed? Are we allowed to bring in new animals, or do we only have internal reproduction and bring in semen in order to get reproduction going on? What is the health status of the industry, and what's the age at market? All of those things affect our need for the use of antimicrobials. And lastly, of course, we are working in a business environment in agriculture. We do have to pay our own way. And so we are looking at things like, what does my quality assurance program allow me to do? What kind of a veterinary client-patient relationship do I have? Are there market opportunities for a never ever or raised without antimicrobial product? And if so, can I meet those? And can I actually raise that kind of animal on my farm? One of the things that's never talked about is market volatility, extreme profits or losses. Those things affect our decisions on whether to use antimicrobials. So you can imagine that when you're a feedlot producer and you're buying in calves at $1,500 a pop, you're probably not going to sit there and watch it be sick for 4 days before you decide to treat it, right? When you've bought that calf in at $650, $700, it's a different profit loss. And we don't want to talk about that because, you know, talking about money is a little bit dirty. We are in business, and those business realities do affect antimicrobial decisions. And there's one more elephant in the room that I need to talk about before I leave the stage and pass you on to learn about how we use antimicrobials in human medicine. We have been driven as an industry to address stewardship, both by the government and by organizations like the CDC, the Public Health Agency of Canada, groups like yourself. But we are also very much being driven to look at our antimicrobial use and our antimicrobial stewardship by the marketplace. And that is a mixed blessing, but it is a reality of the business environment that we are working in. And we are trying to, as an industry, grapple with these never-ever programs that potentially affect animal welfare. Because as veterinarians and producers, not only are we in the business of producing safe food, we're in the business of producing safe, healthy animals that aren't suffering. And so that has been a real challenge for us to identify those places where we have room to minimize or change our antimicrobial use without putting our animals at risk. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I think we're going to do questions at the end.